So, all right, so we're one step closer. Now we just need, once Linus comes in, and then we will be off. And share sound. Share. Okay, we're just waiting for Linus, and then whoops, good, good, good. Oh, I don't remember what speed I did it on last week. Was it 1.5? Was that 1.5 last week?
Yeah, the music gets better that way.
I couldn't understand the guy. Yeah.
The moment Linus enters in, can I unmute everything? Yep. And yep. Okay. So we're just waiting on Linus. All right, buddy. So I apologize. I'm not normal with me and tech issues. This is a rarity. Sorry.
Blame it on Elaine.
Blame it on Elaine. Oh,
She brought up technology.
tech finally got her. Isn't that what it was?
Yeah.
Okay. You know what? I'm gonna start, and this is just an introduction.
All right, here is the Unclobber course on Leviticus 18 and 20. I want to welcome you, especially if this is your first course that you're taking with me, and then also say welcome back if you maybe have already done a course, maybe the Genesis or Romans 1, and now you're into Leviticus. Let's do this. I titled this course A New Way to Be Human. And hopefully you watched the introduction video already where I shared a little bit about myself and where I come from and my background and why I do this work. And then in this course, we're going to look at the clobber passages in Leviticus 18 and 20. And we're going to unclobber them, okay? We're going to remove them as further justification that anyone can use to discriminate against those who identify as LGBTQ. And here's how I'm going to start this session. Read a little excerpt here from the book Unclobber. And this is, again, chapter 6 is all about Leviticus. And I tell the story of, I was in college, and there was a musician by the name of Andrew Peterson, who used to be one of my favorite songwriters. He still is great, but back then even more so. And he was doing a concert in one of our small event areas there. And he was singing a song. The song is called Come Lord Jesus. And the song has this line. And I'm just going to read it verbatim, even though it's got the F word in it. And I don't like saying that word, but I'm going to say it anyway. And the line of the song goes like this. Tonight in the line of the merchandise store, while they were packing up my bags, I saw the pictures of the prophets with the picket signs screaming, God hates fags. And Andrew was talking about his experience of seeing photos of the people from Westboro Baptist holding their stupid picket signs. And so here's what I write then in the book about after hearing that song as an 18-year-old in college. I write this. At 18 years old and as a freshman in college, this was the first time that I can remember being confronted with the reality of so-called Christians. I would really question Westboro Baptist's right to use the term Christian for themselves, holding the reality of so-called Christians holding picket signs of condemnation toward those who identify LGBTQ. It was so unsettling. I couldn't shake the image for the rest of the night. I was wrecked with thoughts like, even if God is against homosexuality, how in the world can anyone who professes to follow Jesus say that God hates that person? This led me to other questions regarding where people even got the idea in the first place that a gay person is something to be despised or loathed or feared or treated like a criminal and cast to the fringes of society. I started wondering, where did that idea even come from? As I would come to find out, the source for such indignation came from a place where the cynics smirk unsurprised, of course, and the naive are left bewildered like I was. Oh, the Bible. The Bible. That's where these people get their cues from. That's where these individuals get their reasoning and their justification for holding these sort of picket signs. And a lot of it comes from these passages here in Leviticus. And that's what this course here is going to dive into. And it's going to begin with an exploration of the word abomination, because this is the word that has filled countless picket signs. Abomination. That homosexuality is an abomination. So we're gonna unpack that. Then we're gonna back out a little bit and do some contextual work on the book of Leviticus as a whole and the context of these passages in particular. Then we'll zoom back into the two passages in question. And since we have a better grasp on the term abomination at this point, we'll explore what might be going on in these two verses. And then at the end of the course, we'll ask the two questions that I like to ask, which is, okay, so what is the best way to understand this passage then? After looking at the historical and the contextual context, what is the best way to understand what these words are trying to say? And then two, okay, so then what does this passage have to say about homosexuality, sexual orientation, or same-sex relationships? What does this have to say about it? And that's what we're going to get to now. So let's click finish this video and I'll see you on the next one.
I'll tell you that in my experience with unpacking and unclobbering, the Leviticus one has been the one that has been the Leviticus passages has been traditionally some of the most overt and explicit, and the most clobbering, and therefore one of the more difficult ones to unclobber. And so I have found that I appreciate the way in which he starts big and then comes down, starts with a larger view, then comes down to a smaller view. And let's see where he takes us today.
Session 1 of Unclobbering Leviticus 18 and 20. I'm calling this whole course A New Way to Be Human, which, fun fact, I think that's the name of a Switchfoot song. Do you guys remember band Switchfoot? I think they're still making music, but great song. It's a new way to be human. But hey, you didn't take, this is not the course for singing 90s CCM songs, so let's move on. Session 1 is titled Understanding the Term Abomination. Abomination. Because both of these clobber passages in Leviticus hinge on the word.
All right, let me slow it down. There we go.
Word abomination. This is the word, this is the term that has armed countless fundamentalists and that has empowered Christians to lob their attacks against LGBTQ people. Abomination. Abomination. So we have to understand this word because I don't think it's being used properly. So this word is the key, I think, to many of these passages. And once we better understand this word, abomination, then we can unlock these passages in Leviticus. We can unlock them from the cages that have been like sealed and labeled WHD, weapons of homophobic destruction. Once we sort of disarm this term, it really does a lot of the work for us. So let's talk about that. Understanding the term abomination. This English word, abomination, it is an English word, by the way. It is an attempt to translate the Hebrew word tova. And I can remember a number of years ago teaching on this topic, and I said tova. I mean, that's how I pronounce it. I don't always put the in there, just tova. And I remember afterwards, some guy came up to me and he's like, you know, you're mispronouncing that. I'm like, oh, thank you. And to which I say, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. I don't know. It's a dead language. Nobody speaks it anymore. So we're all just sort of doing our best to, but anyway, I say tova. You can pronounce it however you want. But the Hebrew word here is tova. Now, in English, some synonyms for the word abomination, because again, the term abomination is an attempt in the English to translate this Hebrew word tova. But in English, some synonyms for abomination are the following: vile, gross, subhuman. So this is what abomination is describing in English. Something that's vile, that's gross, that's subhuman. And guess what? None of those words convey what tova means. Tova is not about things that are vile or gross or subhuman, and yet that's what abomination points to. So we got a real problem here. So tova was a noun that was used to name the state that you would be in if you committed particular actions. So if you do these things, you would be described as being tova. And what sort of actions might render you a person tova? Well, we could maybe say cultural taboos. Things that were against sort of the I don't know, the ethos, the culture. You do these things and you would be considered tova. So you might say that some synonyms for tova might be things like unclean or tainted or disgraced might be a way to talk about what a person would be if they committed these actions. This is a better idea of what tova is, not subhuman, not vile and gross. So what has happened as a result of translating tova into abomination? What's happened is it's led to this phenomenon called infrahumanization. And this is a term that comes out of psychology that essentially is a way of naming that the humanity of someone has been detached from them. To be infrahumanized is to be seen as less than human. And when someone is seen as less than human, then you don't have to treat them like a human and you don't feel bad about it anymore. So here's what I write in the book in this chapter about the infrahumanization. I say, once a person or a group of people has been infrahumanized, he or she or they has, for all intents and purposes, become a monster, less than human. And monsters do not deserve to be treated with kindness and respect or compassion. And I would argue that this is what has happened and is happening as a result of some Christians' insistence that, quote, homosexuality is an abomination. It dehumanizes gay people, which then allows us to treat them horribly without conflict of our conscience because, well, they're not like us. This is what infrahumanization does. It strips a person of their essential humanity. When they do that, well, then we can treat them like crap and we don't end up actually feeling bad about it. Our consciences don't convict us because they're less than human, so we don't need to treat them like a human. This is what this term abomination has done. So then let's continue our exploration of Tova. And I hope you have, by the way, I should have mentioned this earlier, but in this course, I provide these worksheets for you so that you can work through all these blanks and fill them out. If you're like a printout sort of person, write in, that's great. If you just have the PDF open next to you, I'm not sure how you fill it out, but whatever. It's here for you is my point. And all these blanks help it be a participatory course. So then Tova, here's what I want to say about Tova. Tova, this Hebrew noun, which is a way to name sort of what would happen if you committed cultural taboos. Tova is relative. It's relative by nature, which is to say that even innocuous or even what could be seen as by good actions by others can be labeled Tova. Tova didn't mean something was like objectively inherently evil or wicked. It was relative. What might be Tova to one culture could be Tova to another culture. There's this moment in the book of Exodus where Moses goes to the Pharaoh and requests permission for the Hebrew people to go outside of the city of Egypt to do their worship of Yahweh. And Moses says that because their worship, the Israelites' worship, would be considered Tova to the Egyptians. So again, it's not about things that are Tova are sort of objectively wrong for everybody. It's relative. Like what might be taboo for one culture is not the same as what might be taboo for another culture. This is why I suggest that synonyms are like tainted or disgraced. Shepherds, for instance, were considered Tova to the Egyptians. Well, shepherds aren't abominations, but for the particular culture, it was a taboo. Then the second thing I say about taboo is that it doesn't imply that something is inherently wicked or evil or sinful. Things are not, if they render you Tova, it's not about morality as much as it is about identity. There are foods that were considered Tova, but it's not. But these foods weren't inherently wicked or evil. In fact, there's stories in the Old Testament where the Israelites were told by God, I don't want you to eat these foods, but if you have foreigners or visitors that are hungry, you can give them, they can eat it. Do you see how it's not about things being wicked or evil or sinful? It's just for this particular people group, this would be a taboo. I've got this passage here in the book. I'll read to you that I say this about Tova not being inherently wicked or evil or sinful. I say this: just because an action is labeled Tova, it doesn't mean that action belongs in this category of always a sin in the eyes of the Lord. For example, in Deuteronomy 25, we find a list of instructions regarding how to handle certain controversies and conflicts between Israelites, such as things like don't deliver more than 40 lashes on a condemned offender, or don't muzzle an ox when they tread the corn, the importance of a man marrying his brother's wife if his brother dies. And then in one of the Bible's most fantastic verses, 11 and 12 of Deuteronomy 25, the Israelite people were instructed to cut off the hand of a woman if, while her husband is in fight with another man, she attempts to aid her husband by grabbing the testicles of the other man. You like the visual there? Grabbing the testicles of the other man. Cut off her hand. And then the chapter ends with an admonition to use proper weights when measuring goods so as to not rob one another. And then after all these instructions were laid out, don't muzzle an ox, marry a brother's wife if the brother dies, and so on. After all these are laid out, we read this verse: for all who do such things, all who act dishonestly are Tova to the Lord. So yeah, some of those things we would maybe suggest today are also probably still not a good idea. Maybe don't, as the King James puts it, don't taketh him by the secrets. Make sure to measure weights properly. Yeah, it's not that these are all good things and we're just sort of flipping the script on it. I'm saying they're relative in nature, and it's not about morality, it's about identity. These instructions were for a particular people group and how they were to behave and respond within their culture. And to commit a thing that was a taboo would be to render you Tova. And then finally, the last thing I'll say about Tova is that it was used to describe improper mixing. Improper mixing. So like cross-dressing was listed as Tova. Mixing different seeds in the ground was considered Tova. Combining different fabrics was Tova. Not about morality, but about improper mixing. If things were combined together that shouldn't be combined together for the Israelites in their context, that was labeled Tova. And again, I write this in the book. Tovah is rooted not in evil or immoral actions, not the point here, but in a particular refusal to combine and mix things that should not be mixed. Israel was to be set apart. We'll talk about that in the next session. Israel was to be set apart, and Tovah actions, Tovah behaviors threatened that entire project. Tovah behaviors described activities that transgressed the boundary markers of what it meant to be the people of Israel. They didn't describe activities that were inherently wicked for all time, objectively so, even if it's true, of course, that some Tovah actions would have also been seen in this way. And we'll talk about that in the next session there. But the bottom line, the point that I want to communicate to you, this is why I start this unclobbering of Leviticus. I start here with this term abomination. This is why it's the first session. Because the bottom line is this. Things were considered Tovah if they violated cultural divisions and if they rendered Israelites indistinguishable from the Egyptians from which they came from, which we'll talk about in the next session, and the Canaanites to which they were going. And yet our English Bibles have translated Tovah into abomination, vile, gross, subhuman. This is not what Tovah means. And so now countless Christians have been armed with this like biblical justification for, homosexuality is an abomination. No, that's not what these verses are saying. It's not what these verses are saying. So let's continue going in our exploration, and I'll show you what I mean.
So I would say that I want you to think about in your thought through the context of Tovah and abomination. Well, what is it then that you have experienced in your life that has been Tovah? My first church that I served was in Roanoke, Virginia, and the Appalachian culture, very much more socially conservative environment, not just politically, but more just refrained, very Southern. And there were often conversations about conversations of disgust about persons, those young people who had tattoos, and how inappropriate it was and how unacceptable it is to have tattoos. And for 4 years, I always ensured that I was wearing clothing that did not reveal any of my tattoos. And I sat at these tables often of the inappropriateness, the lambasting of tattoos. And then this beautiful church called me to serve as their pastor. And the culture change was that it was considered a head-turning oddity in Virginia, in Roanoke, Virginia, to see someone walking down the street with as many tattoos as you see here. That was the oddity. Moving here, how surreal it was to be the one that if you are untattooed walking down the street, you might be the unusual one. Not making a statement necessarily one way or another about tattoos, but again, this idea of the cultural appropriateness, the tovah, that what might be considered appropriate in one culture might not be another. And we even have that within our families. The way in which we prepare our food, the way in which we do our holiday traditions. There is the right way, and there is the way that I always try to suggest in my family, which is wrong, and I lose, right? Because this is how we did. This is how we did it in our family. This is what's appropriate, and I'm being flippant, of course, but I hope that gives some for us to begin spurring some idea about how we might think through this concept of tovah, that which is different. It's only been in the last year or two that I've learned about halal meat. And I'm not going to give a lesson on halal meat right now, but anyone who knows me knows that I love eating meat. And halal meat is meat that is prepared and sold for religious purposes, purification purposes, that is very different than the meat that I purchase from HEB, right? These are just cultural differences, one that might be acceptable within one culture and religious following and versus another, okay? All right. let's keep going here on the broader context.
All right, on to session 2 of Unclobbering Leviticus 18 and 20, a new way to be human. And this should be a relatively quick-ish session since the last one was a little bit longer. I almost said sorry, but I'm not sorry. This is good stuff here. Session 2, I'm calling the broader context of the book of Leviticus. We're kind of zooming out a little bit and asking what the heck is the deal with the book of Leviticus in general. Broader context of the book of Leviticus. And I hope you've got your sheets to follow along at home. But I'll say this, the broader context of Leviticus is all about this. What we're dealing with here is we're dealing with people who have just recently been liberated from Egypt. So Leviticus as a whole was written by the tribe of Levi, the priestly tribe. In fact, many scholars would even point out that it was written by and for the people, the tribe of Levi. So in some regards, you could be like, actually, everything that's in the book of Leviticus is really just kind of for the tribe of Levi, which makes some interesting sort of, if you extrapolate that out. But anyway, so Leviticus is written by the tribe of Levi for, I'll just say for the sake of, for this, that's just for the people of Israel. The idea here is that how are we going to now be humans if we're no longer slaves in Egypt? Because for a number of generations, the Hebrew people were just defined by how many bricks they could make. They were slaves under Pharaoh in Egypt. And yet through Moses and Aaron and Miriam, they've now been freshly liberated and they've left Egypt. And now they're wandering the wilderness, asking questions of themselves like, okay, well, now who are we? Supposedly there's some promised land out there in Canaan, but we're not there yet. We're just sort of wandering here in the wilderness. Who are we if we're not slaves? And how do we now function? How do we now sort of relate to ourselves? How do we relate to one another? How do we relate to God? What does it mean to be a tribe? When you've only ever been defined by being a certain identity, which is slaves in Egypt, now you got to sort of figure out who you are and who you're going to be. And this is what the book of Leviticus is all about. Great, so my blanks there. Israel was a newly liberated tribe. They were freed from Egypt and they were on their way toward Canaan. And so this book of Leviticus, it was a collection, you might say, a composition of commands and laws that were compiled for the, like I said earlier, the tribe of Levi. But I think it's fine if we want to say, broaden that out a bit for the people of Israel in general. But I do think it's worth pointing out that some scholars would suggest that everything in here is just for the Levi tribe. And so the point of Leviticus here is to guide Israel on how to be, this new way of being human, how to be a tribe in the world, how to function religiously and relationally. You could map out the book of Leviticus into, oftentimes scholars will say it's made up of 3 sections. And section 1 is chapters 1 through 10, which is all about the sacrificial system. Chapter 11 through 17 is about ritual purification. And then chapter 18 through 27, the rest of Leviticus is called the Holiness Code. And this is what this section here, the last section, is what contains our 2 clobber passages. But the point I want to make in this session is just to say this, that Leviticus is all about sort of trying to figure out how can we be a new people group, not defined by being slaves in Egypt, and yet not like the Canaanites from which they were heading to. And this is what Leviticus is all about.
So one thing I'd have you think about, one thing I'd have you think about is try to envision your 400 years as enslaved persons in Egypt. Generations, scores of generations of families and folks have been born, raised, died under a certain tyranny of enslavement. And for generations, you as a people have only ever known one way of life. Now you are on a new side. You've been liberated. You're on a new path. You're in a completely uncharted territory that has not existed for more than 400 years. How then do we be in us in relationship with God in this new reality? And contextually, probably one of the closer things that we can think through is the longevity of how long the United States had slavery on the books. And then came the end to that. How long has it taken us since the end of the Civil War through the 1970s to present day for us to put on the books? How do we live in a post-enslavement society? How then do we write laws that govern us, that help us to be in us according to how we are striving to become? Does this make sense? Because we've only ever known one way of life for 400 years, right? And even to today, we have such an ingrained cultural awareness, and especially in the Southern societies, of how we have ever only operated. And there is an unlearning of that, which must be met with some guidelines, right? Okay, now on to the clobber passages.
All right, let's keep going. Session 3. I'm calling session 3 the broader context of the clobber passages. So we zoomed all the way in first session, talked about the term abomination and the word tova. We zoomed back out to get a larger sense of what the point of Leviticus was all about. And now let's get into the actual passages themselves, which are in chapter 18 and in chapter 20. And I'll say this, like I mentioned in the last session, chapter 18 is kind of the beginning of what scholars are referred to as the holiness code portion of Leviticus. And this is about not so much how humans should relate to God. So that was in other sections in Leviticus, sort of the religious part, like what does it look like to be people of Yahweh? What do our sacrifices, what do our rites, what do our rituals look like? This section, the holiness code, is about how do we relate to one another? How do we treat each other in ways that sort of point people to what Yahweh is? How do we treat each other in ways that are different from the Egyptians from whence we came and the Canaanites to where we're going? How do we be, like this whole course is called, what's a new way to be human look like? In chapter 18, where this first clobber passage is found, the whole thing is about family. It's all about how to relate and how not to relate to members in your family. We get 18 verses in chapter 18, 18 verses that are all about protecting the family dynamic. And we see prohibitions against really every conceivable form of incest. It's really what the whole chapter is really just one long stream of, don't practice incestual sexual relations. And there's also a verse in there about not sacrificing your child to Molech. But the whole section, this whole part of Leviticus is all about don't do what they did in Egypt and don't do what they do in Canaan where you're going, but be different. And that's what your first blank is. Do things differently. This is what the word holy means. It just means to be set apart. This is what the Israelites were called by Yahweh to do, is to be different. Don't be like the Egyptians from whence you came. Don't be like the Canaanites to where you're going. This is how this Leviticus 18 starts out. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do things like they're done in the land of Egypt, where I just liberated you from, where you used to live. And you must not do things like they're done in the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you, aka the promised land. You must not follow the practices of those places. No, my regulations and my rules are the ones that you must keep by following them. I am the Lord your God. This is how the holiness code begins. This is how chapter 18 begins. And so that's kind of the bigger context. Like, here's a list of all the things that they did in Egypt or they're doing in Canaan, and I want you to do things differently. Okay? And so this is where the clobber passages then show up. And you might be familiar with these, but Leviticus 18, verse 22, again, after a long list of all the ways that incest is taken off the books, can't do incest, can't do it, can't sleep with your mom, can't sleep with your stepmom, can't sleep with your sister. Like every version of incestual relationships have been listed. And then verse 22 says, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman, for it is tova. And I prefer to just put tova in there, not abomination, because our minds, we hear abomination and we think vile, gross, subhuman. I want us to pull away from that because this is not what the verse is saying. It's tova. It's cultural taboo. It violates our cultural boundaries. And then we get the same language shown up here, or shows up again in Leviticus 20:13. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, and both of them have committed tova, but then there's the added, I almost said benefit, it's not a benefit, there's the added command of the death penalty. I'm laughing at the absurdity of it, not because it's funny. It's clearly not funny, but it is a bit absurd. And there are some scholars who say that the whole, like, because a lot of things were sort of given the threat of the death penalty in ancient Jewish law. And I've read Jewish scholars that say, but there really isn't any evidence that the death penalty was ever actually given. It was really more of a just sort of this sense of severity, like, no, seriously, guys, let's take this serious, as opposed to actual laws that were, nobody's actually put to death is the point. But anyway, that's what the verse says. So for me, what I suggest is that really what's going on here is that it's about restoring the sacredness of family. It's about restoring the sacredness of family. So whatever the Egyptians were like and the Canaanites were like, there was clearly not a real high value put on the family. And so in 18, like I mentioned earlier, chapter 18, the point here is just no incest. Verse 6, no sex with a blood relative. Verse 7, not your mother. Verse 8, not your stepmom. Verse 9, not your sister or your half-sister. Verse 10, not your granddaughter. Verse 11, not your stepsister. Like, see how detailed this gets? Verse 12 and 13, you can't have sex with your aunt on either side. Neither one of them. Or your aunt by marriage, verse 14. Or your daughter-in-law, verse 15. Or your sister-in-law, verse 16. You can't have group sex with a woman and her daughter and her granddaughter. So if you're to try to find some loophole where you could grab in multiple family members in, then it's okay. I mean, that's what they did in Egypt. No, you can't do that either. No sex with a woman while she's menstruating, verse 19. No sex with another married woman, verse 20. Then verse 21, don't sacrifice your children to Moloch. And I would just argue that probably also has to do with restoring sacredness to the family. I think child sacrifice probably really can jack up family dynamics. And then verse 22. So all of that listed there, everything listed there gets up to verse 22, which then says, don't have sex with a man as with a woman, which we're going to dive into what's the wording there in the next session. And then verse 23, also no sex with animals. So my point is when you look at the whole context of Leviticus chapter 18 and 20 is very similar. The whole thing is about restoring the sacredness of the family and not committing violations of incest, sexual relationships within the family dynamic. And chapter 18 ends by saying, do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for by all of these, the nations that I'm driving you out, which is Egypt, have become unclean. So keep my charge to never practice any of these tovah customs that were practiced before you. Okay? So that is the end of this session, as we understand that the broader context of these clobber passages are within a larger group of verses that were all about restoring the sacredness of the family, with a special emphasis on not committing incestual sexual relationships. So keep that in mind as we head into the next session.
So, so one of the other parts that some have argued with regard to those, and it's in the category of family, right? Restoring the family. Some of what have added to that is that you who have been brought out are a small conglomeration of people. And in this time of the wilderness, as we are making our way to the new land of milk and honey, this is the time for us to multiply, to grow, and to foster the strength of family, but also to increase in number, as God had said to Abraham and Sarah, right? The time of growth. And therefore, I think he's correct within the idea that there's these large ideas of the reduction of the value of family in these other societies, even to the point of incestual relationships, even to the point of incestual relationships of the same sex, right? And so the holiness of this is a reestablishing, a recentering of these values that you have only ever known for 400 years, to the ways in which God is growing and strengthening a new and doing a new thing with you as a light for the world. Tracking with me there? Okay.
right, session 4. Let's keep going. We are unclobbering Leviticus 18 and 20. But you know this already. I don't know why I'm recapping. So here's what session 4 is called. I'm calling it 4 Key Observations About the Translation. And again, hopefully you have your worksheet that you can follow along with to fill in the blanks as they come. So as I was thinking about this session, I was thinking, you know, once you remove Genesis 19 from the equation, so if you haven't yet done the Genesis course, I invite you to do that. Maybe after this, just knock out the whole Old Testament. But once you take out Genesis 19, like these 2 verses in Leviticus are it for all of the Old Testament instances where maybe there's some biblical indication for words of condemnation against homosexuality. Like that's it. So if these 2 verses aren't clear and concise and to the point, then we don't really have anything in the Old Testament. Like everything sort of hinges on this. And I, as I'm about to show, I just don't think it's as cut and clean and clear and dry, or however those words work. I don't think it's as clean as the English translations want us to believe. It's pretty easy to open up an English Bible and just read, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination," and be like, there it is, that says it. Deborah, go ahead and put that one on the sign and we'll take it over to the place where we march and hold the signs up. I'm like, no, I don't know where that accent came from. But like it feels obvious and clear in the English. But it isn't once you start to dig, just scratch a little bit at the surface and get under a little bit of what's going on here. And it's really not as clear as you might think it is. And I think that matters. So let's dig in. Here we go. First, so we've got 4 key observations here. So the first observation is this. There's an odd juxtaposition of nouns going on. And I'm treating, by the way, these 2 verses, I'm treating them identical because they are the same except for that 20 has that death penalty that we talked about in the last session. But in these verses, there's an odd juxtaposition of nouns in the Hebrew. So the Hebrew language has different nouns, whether you want to talk about like a gender, so male or female, or if you want to talk about a specific individual person, a man and woman or husband and wife. You would use different nouns for that. And in these clobber passages, the reason why I bring that up is because in these clobber passages, it says a male, which is the general use for gender, a male shall not lie with a male, again, sort of the general gender, as with and then it switches, as with a specific woman or wife. Oftentimes in Hebrew, you'll see these groups together. So if you're using male, you would use the term for female, and then if you're using man, you would use the term for woman. And man and husband are the same. Man and husband are the same noun, and woman and wife are the same. So you have to use context to know which one the author intends to mean. Is it man or husband, or is it woman and wife? But the point is these are often grouped together. And so this is interesting in that it's got the general male. You shall not lie with male, as with and then it switches to this specific, as with a woman, or as with a wife, which if you watched last session, which I assume you would, because I assume you're going in order, we talked about how Leviticus 18 is all about prohibitions against different incest, different sexual relations within the family dynamic. So what that suggests to me is that there's a specific or contextualized situation at stake here in these clobber passages. That it's not just this blanket condemnation to not have sex with people of the same sex, but it's very specific. You shall not lie with a male as with a wife, as with a woman. Okay, so that's the first observation I want to make. Second is, I call it a superfluous specification. Superfluous specification. So if the goal is in these 2 prohibitions in Leviticus, if the goal here is for Israelites to be like, all right, we're going to ban homosexuality, we're going to ban any and all same-sex sex acts, then why is there the second half of the verse? Why not just stop with a male shall not lie with a male? Like that covers it, right? But it doesn't stop there. It's a male shall not lie with a male as with a woman or as with a wife. Now there's a Jewish exegetical principle, exegetical meaning sort of how you interpret things. There's a Jewish exegetical principle which goes like this. If a generalization is followed by a specification, then only what is specified applies. Only what is specified applies. And so in these verses, you shall not lie, a male shall not lie with a male, that's the general, followed by specification as with a woman or a wife. So the point here is, if that happens, if you see a generalization followed by a specification, only what is specified applies. Again, so this goes back to what I said on the previous slide, that there is clearly a very particular context or specific action at stake here. This is not a blanket universal condemnation. There's something in mind that the Levite priests were trying to name in addition to don't sleep with your mom and your stepmom and your aunt on either side. There's a specific act going on here, lying with a male as with a wife or with a woman. That act, whatever it is, that's the specification. That's the one that applies, not the general a male shall not lie with a male. Does that make sense? I don't know why I'm asking, not like you can respond, but it was rhetorical. Okay, third point. Third point is this. In the English Bible, we have this little phrase, as with a woman. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. But really, there is no preposition happening here in the Hebrew. This whole as with thing that we put in the English, see if I can find it. That is not in the Hebrew. It's not there. Really, all that you have is a male shall not lie with a male, and then it says mishkveh. And mishkveh is kind of hard to interpret. It's kind of a clunky word. There's only really one other place in the scriptures where this shows up, and it literally means the layings of a woman or the beds of a wife. So there isn't even the phrase as with the wife. It's just, you shall not lie with a male, the lyings of a woman. You shall not lie with a male, the beds of a wife. And again, we start to see this very, very sort of zeroed in act going on here, this very specific thing, not any sort of blanket condemnation. There is no as with in the Hebrew. It's not as with a woman. It's just the beds of a wife or the layings of a woman. And then finally, the fourth observation I want to make about this, and again, the whole point of this session here is to just show that it's not as clear as people either pretend that it is or don't realize that it's not. I don't know if I said that properly. But the fourth observation here is it's ladies' night until further notice, because you might have noticed at this point that there's zero mention for women. There's zero condemnation for lesbianism. It's just a male shall not lie with a male, the beds of a wife. So if the point here was to sort of speak to all of Israel, this word from the Lord that homosexuality is an abomination, then where is the mention of women having sex with women? It's not there. So the goal in this session was to really just point out these observations about how there's some ambiguity in the text. There's some bizarre Hebrew idioms that don't translate well into English or don't translate well into our culture. And there's some things that are really missing, such as any word about sexual orientation and any word about lesbianism. And so what I wanted to just demonstrate is that things are not as clean and cut and obvious as they often appear to be. And I think, again, if we take out Genesis 19, these are the only two verses that the whole entire Old Testament, the whole entire Jewish tribe had to work with. If we're looking for some sort of clear and obvious statement from God about God's perspective and feelings around homosexuality, we're not finding it here in Leviticus 18 and 20. We're just not. We're noticing that the tribe of Levite is identifying a very specific act that probably has some context within incest, and it's only that is prohibited, but it is not this blanket condemnation against any and all same-sex sex acts.
Let's move on to the last one.
Excuse us, Josh. We need
Yes. If you need to roll. And thank you for being here.
All right, let's bring this course home, shall we, as we head into our final session, session 5. And as I title all the final sessions of each one of these courses, I'm just calling this Unclobbering Leviticus 18 and 20, because that's what we're doing, is we're removing the damaging power from this clobber passage. As I told you in the introduction, the plan here is to dive into the historical context and the context within the literature itself. And we're going to look at some of the original language, and we're going to try to understand what was going on. And we're going to ask these questions of, what do these verses have to say about those who identify as LGBTQ? What do these verses have to say about those who are in a same-sex relationship? Do these truly justify discrimination? Because this is how they've been used for way too long in the church. And especially these verses have been used to arm people with this horrible messages, to put on their picket signs, to shame people on message boards, to cut off family members. And it's not okay. Not only is it just not okay on a human kindness love level, but it doesn't even work with the text. It doesn't even work with the source material. There is no legitimate justification here. And so in this session, this is what I've tried to show. I've tried to show that the word abomination isn't itself an abominable translation. Like, that English word doesn't belong in the text. It is not a proper understanding of the term tovah. I've tried to show that the language itself, although it seems so clear in English, once you dig into the Hebrew, it's really funky and murky and odd, and there are things going on there that seem very specific and not at all this sort of blanket condemnation. And then we've tried to just understand in general what's the point of Leviticus. So then I guess here's my closing slides for this session, is that when we look at these verses in Leviticus 18, what we discover is that the point of this Leviticus book from the tribe of Levi was to invite Israel to embody their calling, to reveal to the world the character of Yahweh. And that invitation involved living differently, living holy, which is to say set apart. Don't do like the Egyptians from whence I just freed you from, and don't be like the Canaanites to which you're going. Be different, be holy, be set apart. And if anyone did anything that violated that mission, or if anybody did anything that sort of compromised that call to be different, to be set apart, then it was considered tovah. And that could be anything from mixing fabrics. No, don't do that. That could be anything from eating certain foods. No, that's the foods they eat. That's the food. That could be certain actions. No, that's the things they do. You're called to be and do these specific things to be this type of people in the world. I think I think a decent argument could be made that it really is just confined to that calling, to that people group, to that time in history. That even for us today, to look back and be like, cool. So yeah, that's what was said back then, but that was really just contextually for them in that time. Like, what does it have to do with us in the 21st century? But even then, I think you can dive, and that's what we've done in this session, or in this course, you can dive into these actual texts and discover that not only do they not have any application for today, but they don't even say what people have argued they have said. So that's what tovah is. It's not an abomination. It's about violating cultural boundaries, and people, or the Israelites, are called to be different, to reveal to the world the character of God. So that was why it was such a big deal. Like, don't do these things. Don't do these things. And things, again, let me remind you, tovah does not mean they were universally objectively inherently wicked or sinful. That's not what tovah meant. So we need to quit just assuming that anytime the Bible, the Old Testament, has the word tovah, or we read abomination, that this is like a disgusted deity frowning upon humans. Well, no, this is not what tovah is. And then the last blank there is, look, whatever sex act the Levites intended, whatever they were naming, which I'm not sure we have a real great grasp on, but it has something to do with men lying with men, the lyings of a wife, bedwife. Whatever that was, within the context of the passage, clearly it was practiced in Egypt, and clearly the Canaanites did it, and so the Israelites were like, we're not going to do that. We're going to abstain from that. But I do think it's clear that it was not about sexual orientation. This prohibition was not some sort of ancient declaration that those who were attracted to people of the same sex were broken or disordered or any of that. And this was not a blanket condemnation. This is not just any and all same-sex sex acts are off the table, because again, that's not what the construct of the Hebrew words are saying, and there's just nothing being said to or about women and lesbians. So yeah, so that's the conclusion of it. So to my questions, what does this have to say to sexual orientation? Nothing. It really doesn't. What does it have to say to any sort of specific prohibition? Like, can this be used to justify discrimination? No, it can't, and it shouldn't. It shouldn't. And so when you take this and you put it next to the Genesis 19, you discover, yeah, there's nothing in the Old Testament that provides any sort of justification to discriminate against those who identify LGBTQ. Can you start to see and start to taste how the power that these passages have held for so long within the world of Christianity is starting to just dissipate before your very eyes? Like, yeah, I'm kind of reminded of the story in John chapter 8 of the story of the men being caught throwing rocks, where they bring this woman who was in the act of adultery to Jesus, and they want Jesus to condone their condemnation of her. And he famously says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," and they just sort of one by one drop their stones, realizing, well, I got nothing left. And then Jesus says to the woman, "Okay, so where are all your accusers?" And that's kind of how I start to feel with these verses as we unclobber them. Drop that stone, Genesis 19. Drop that stone, Leviticus 18:20. Yeah, so what's left? What's left to clobber you? As far as Old Testament goes, nothing. Nothing. But we do have a couple to get through in the New Testament. And so I hope that if you haven't yet purchased the Romans or the Corinthians and Timothy one, that you will do that. You'll join me there. Or if you've purchased the whole course together and you're ready to jump into that, then I will see you as we dive into Romans. That'll be the next one in this course. But for now, I want to say thank you for joining me here on this Unclobber workshop. It has been a delight to share this time and this space with you, even though we're obviously in 2 different places and 2 different times. I still can feel some degree of connection with you on the other side of this digital miracle that we're doing here with these online courses. So peace, love, and well-being to you. Goodbye.
All right, so let's, it really does not like it when I try to stop share. It just does not, it is not behaving in a professional manner. Gosh, I hope we don't lose you, Lennis. I'm just gonna keep talking as if we have not lost you, Lennis.
You said earlier, you heard it.
Okay,
Wow, this picture is up there.
so let's remember last week in Genesis 19, one of the key points that he was conveying about with the passage and the unclobbering of that passage was that it was speaking about what? What was it saying with regard to the point of that passage from last week? About what the group who was outside of Lot's house, who were wanting to, yeah, go ahead. Frank.
It was about hospitality and how we treat each other. That's what that whole thing was about. And what they were doing to the visitors was disrespect, and there was another word.
Hold it.
Shame.
Power. Nancy, what were you gonna say then?
Well, one of the points was that all the people, all those outside could not have all been homosexuals because it's so wrong.
Right, so,
So therefore, it wasn't pointing to that.
yes, right there. Power and humiliation, right? There was a movement of the people, and God's word to us through that passage is that when we are sexually offending others for the means of power and humiliation, that is inappropriate, right? That is counter to the ways of God. And how would we sum up what we have today, John?
I'm going to say the exact same thing. I mean, how do I phrase it? The presentation did a good job of walking, I think, to that last point, but he stopped short. Because in the study we did last time where we used the book God and the Gay Christian, that author did I thought a little bit better job of going into the context of the time. Said these passages in the Old Testament are not about homosexuality because they didn't have that context back there. There was no word, no kind of descriptions, anything. They didn't have a context of a homosexual orientation. And so he said that here, but he didn't go, I didn't think, deep enough into it. And that if he did, he would have understood why lesbians aren't accounted for, because it's not about orientation at all.
Correct.
It's about the power and the humiliation.
There it is.
And the sex acts that in this passage, I remember where they talked about the Egyptians and the Canaanites doing were when one army conquered the other and took the people as slaves, they humiliated the men and subjugated the men by male rape.
Correct.
Basically. And so when it says you don't lie with a man as with a woman, that means when you're doing the male rape of the people, the army you just conquered, it's degrading them as a male. It's making them fall into the category of being treated like a woman.
Right.
And that power and humiliation.
And we have,
about
look, these terms that are being laid out by the Levites for the people are also what will continue to guide them as God is delivering them into the land of Canaan, right? So as we are being delivered into the land of Canaan, we should not be doing the things that the Egyptians did when they dominated, nor the Canaanites do when they dominate. win victoriously and dominate, which is to lie with men as bedwives, right? And for power and humiliation, correct? These are things that we're laying out for you so that you might be distinguished from them, set apart from them in that regard.
Be better people.
Right, but even in the context of Leviticus 18, when this author is honing in on the idea of the bulk of that passage is focused on the context of incest. You know, I also add into this patriarchal society when you are the male power of influence in that structure, and you are asserting your male power dominance within your family structure, whether that's your child, your aunt on either side, a stepsister, you are asserting power in a way that is humiliating. Make sense? Right? And so thus we have more of that unclobbering. And what I'm hoping is, I'm sure and aligned with his view as well, which is that the work that we're doing in unclobbering that is reframing the context. I think it is incredibly important for us, as the scriptures became canonized within the totality of them. The 66 books became canonized hundreds of years after Jesus, right? That we still hold today, that we also see that while these are good for the building up of our relationship with God and with each other, they also still include great historical awareness of how we came to be us. We are not to eliminate the parts of our scripture that bear good historical documentation of the movement of God. If we were to eliminate that, then we would erase First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, right? Because those are great historical books of the Old Testament that document the historical movement of God's people. That would be like saying that we should never study the well, in the last couple of years, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, and I apologize for dropping this and then moving on. But in the last few years, especially within the United States, an educational movement called the 1619 Project, right? That begins to hone in on American history of what became some of the foundational elements that sanctionized and made legal and culturally appropriate the power and humiliation of persons who are non-white, right? Whether they were Black, whether they were here in the formerly land of Mexico, and all of the ways in which we subjugated Native Americans as well as former cultural Mexicans. And the fear is that by studying that we will learn something about ourselves that we need to just forget. That's not the point of why we should just eliminate Leviticus from the 66 books of the Bible, right? It is a way in which we come to understand and know how God was at work through us, loved us, is galvanizing us and preparing us for a new way of life, not so much that it is prescriptive, but so that we may be illumined in the development of our faith, right?
So this is a subject I studied a lot in my life. And my question is this: if we're understanding that the way we've translated the original text into English is misleading and causing a lot of harm, why don't we fix the translation?
I will bring a resource next week. They're sitting on my shelves right now, and I want to conclude on your question. Now I'm going to rise. I want to conclude on your question for a very important reason. And that is why I strongly encourage you to bring your own Bible. Because as we're reading along, if you see a word, a phrase, or an expression in what we're reading that is different than the NRSV or what's being read out loud, that is our invitation to say why. Why is this different? Why is this something that, wrong one. Um, I need to dig in further into understanding this. So on my shelf in my office, I have three particular books, which I appreciate. One is the Egalitarian Bible, and it was a study Bible, and it is a translation that has been specifically written to unpack a lot of and retranslate into English more appropriately, or to minimize some of the power language that is inherently there. Now, in fairness, they're not all the best way to translate from the Hebrew to English or from Greek to English, but it does a better job of helping us to minimize the way in which the English has been written from a power perspective. That's one. The second Bible that I have is the Jewish Study Bible, and I absolutely love that. It is my go-to resource when I'm doing sermons from the Old Testament. This is a translation from Hebrew into English that has been translated by rabbinic scholars and who are much more knowledgeable in Hebrew than I. And their study notes help us understand how and why it is they chose to translate these passages differently. It reads differently from the NRSV. And then the third one I have is only focused in the New Testament, and, and it is called uh, I forget the name, the way in which it's titled, but it is essentially um, Native American translation. And when the evangelical movement, evangelism movement, began to reach out to the indigenous and native persons of North America, the way in which uh, they were instructed was, through the King James version English, with the this and the thous and the thous and the dies and all this, that, and the other. That doesn't culturally translate into an awareness of understanding into those persons who have the First Nations, Native Indigenous persons here. So this translation is written specifically from those within that culture and using cultural expressions and understandings that is authentic or at least faithful to the the story, but it is a story that is then told in their own language. It's beautiful. And I will probably read from multiple versions of that at some point during the summer, as I usually try to. All that being said is, let's just look at the English translations. In the English translations, we have the NRSV, which our denomination, and by and large and whole, subscribes to. It is a great academic, excellent approach to and faithful to the original scripts. But there are issues. Um, in various places, because sometimes it's more wonky to read. The word abomination does not exist in the NRSV. The word homosexuality does not exist in the NRSV in the New Testament. If you read from the NIV, the New International Version, what you got over there?
This is the common. Yeah, this was.
So,
Common.
Common English Bible, okay? Anybody else got their Bibles with you today? That's okay. The NIV is one that is absolutely kind of if you were a Baptist church, non-denominational church, and you had Bibles in your pews, this is probably what you have. And the word homosexuality was never in an English version translation of the Bible until 1946. And as we came into translations like the New International Version. And that was infused into, and I'm sure he'll talk about that in the coming weeks. That is a word that was infused. There was a theological perspective that guided the ways in which those publishers and those writers, those translators, said, this is what this means. And rather than being faithful to the manuscripts, they said, we're going to write it this way. Make sense? And that is just not faithful, because that's not what those texts say. So why don't we just go back and rewrite it? There are ways to be faithful to that. The one that I began embracing the better part of a decade ago is the Common English Bible, the CEB. Is that what you have
Yes,
there? And what's great about the NIV is that it reads easier than the NRSV, the New Revised. It just reads easier. But there is theological perspectives that are infused into the English, which I don't appreciate. The Common English Bible is a much easier way to read the Bible. The readability is more accessible, and it is still high academically faithful to the translations. Y'all tracking with me? I hope that I'll be sending out an email the next day or two unpacking all of this to the whole of the congregation, not just to y'all. I do this, if you've been around a while, you know, I usually do this about once a year. I have a particular email that I send out on top of this. So that's why. That's why all Presbyterian pastors are required to study Hebrew and Greek, so that we begin to understand and that we are academically trained, A, to do it on our own, but also two, to be critical about the ways in which these English translations can be packed. I remember the first time that I ever translated from Greek into English, I realized the power I had in choosing how to translate something from Greek into English. And I could have you read a passage the way that I thought that I wanted you to read it. And that's just me sitting down with the Greek translation and trying to be faithful, but also I have discretion to say, I've chosen this word for this reason as it aligns with my theology. That's some heavy power. And that's what makes this complicated. And that's what I appreciate with this here, that when we are faithful in our textual study of these two passages of the Old Testament, we unclogger them, what's left? In the entirety of the Old Testament, what's left? Nothing, right? And yet we have given so much weight, right? You may hear some folks who do some quick jabs to the Leviticus passages who are speaking and trying to unclogger and say, well, one of the other things in Leviticus is that you should never have a beard. And well, there he is teaching about this wearing a beard, and then there's John with his big old beard. Well, you are now an abomination, right? Anyone who eats shrimp would also be an abomination, right? Because it outlines it in Leviticus that these are not things that we should do.
I actually had shrimp caught in my beard.
Double win. So with that, let me be the one who closes us in prayer today. Creator God, as we leave this space, give us the courage to author our own stories with authenticity. Help us to share our journeys with others, inspiring and understanding one another through the stories of our lives. May we find purpose in the unique paths you have laid out for each of us, and may our stories bring glory to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. Thank you for your patience today, and we will see y'all next week. And I will send an email out to you tomorrow with preparations for next Sunday. Sorry for the tech issues.
Everybody have a happy holidays. Anybody want to go? Go to Orange. Off we go.
I don't know, I mean, I've seen before.
By the way.
Thank you very much.
Besides that, I like, what a rookie man.
No.
So how you like that?
Sounds good. Sounds good.